Hi. In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of macromolecules. In class, we learned that a macromolecule is a really large molecule. Macro means large. And they're carbon-based. So what that means is the carbon's ability to form four bonds allows them to become very, very large. That's how they attach to one another. If you look at the four classifications of biological macromolecules, we see carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. At least three of those ought to sound familiar to you because you hear a lot about it on our nutritional labels on food. The reason why we see it on nutritional labels is because the things that we eat are made up of organisms. So these are the molecules that are not only relevant for nutrition and health, but they're also the molecules that are relevant for biology because that's what makes us up. We're going to start by talking about carbohydrates. Looking first at carbohydrates, these are all four examples of carbohydrates. They have a number of things in common. If you notice, they're made up of only three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if you notice, they all have a very particular proportion. So this first one, glyceraldehyde, has 3 carbons, 6 hydrogens, and 3 oxygens. Next one, 4, 8, and 4. Next one, 5, 10, and 5. And finally, glucose has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. What that means is they all have the same ratio of those 3 elements, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And that's one of the defining characteristics of a carbohydrate. Looking closely at these diagrams, at this slide, you'll also notice that these are labeled as a monosaccharide. A monosaccharide is a monomer of a carbohydrate. Remember, carbohydrates are types of polymer. A polymer is a molecule made up of a repeating unit. In the case of large macromolecules, the repeating unit is called the monomer, and the monomer's name for carbohydrates is monosaccharide. Looking at these pictures, though, there's one thing that doesn't quite represent a carbohydrate, and that is their shape. Carbohydrates in reality don't look like this. Instead of being a long chain, what we see is they take on a ring form. So this is probably the one that's best known and the one that you'll know the best by the end of the year, called glucose. Glucose is a very, very important molecule, and if you notice, it, like all of the other carbohydrates, are forming a ring shape. The carbons connect to each other, and then the oxygens and the hydrogens stick out on top and bottom. So let's get some stuff down in your notes. As I mentioned, the common elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The monomer is named monosaccharide, and generally monosaccharides have between 3 and 7 carbons in their monosaccharides, and then, of course, with between 3 and 7 oxygens, thanks to that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And like I said, those carbon chains curl up and form rings in the shapes of usually pentagons or hexagons that then can connect to each other when they're in part of a larger molecule. Let's talk about the different examples of carbohydrates. Monosaccharides are some of the few things that exist by themselves in nature. So some of the monosaccharides, which would just be a single sugar ring, you're probably familiar with. Like I said, glucose. These are known as the simple sugars. Glucose is an example. Fructose, as in high fructose corn syrup. Galactose, ribose. These are all examples of monosaccharides, that is one carbon chain in the form of a ring. Their function is quick release energy. So think about if you had a high fructose beverage or food item, you're getting a lot of sugar and you can have a very quick burst of energy. Quite often, 2 monosaccharides are joined together in what we call a disaccharide. Disaccharides, as their name implies, have 2 rings in them. We'll see in lab that those 2 rings are joined together through the process of dehydration synthesis. So one hydrogen and one hydroxide or an OH group are removed, and they're joined together like this to make 2 rings connected together. Sucrose, which is table sugar, and lactose, as in the kind in milk when people are lactose intolerant. They can't digest the lactose that's in milk. So those are both disaccharides, and their function is also quick release energy. Same reason you would get a sugar high if you had a lot of candy, which is made of sucrose. The last type of carbohydrate is called a polysaccharide. Polysaccharides, as their name implies, are made up of many rings. Now, when I say many, I really mean many. It's not usually like 3 or 4. It's usually lots. Those are the really, really big macromolecules. And starch and glycogen are 2 examples. Starch and glycogen have a similar function. They both are in charge of storing a lot of bulk energy. A lot of you who are in sports are probably familiar with the idea of having a great big pasta meal before you exercise. the night before or the morning of. That's so that you have a lot of energy available to you when you go and do that exertion. So starch is a plant energy storage molecule. That's why it's in pasta and bread and things like that. Glycogen is how animals store energy, bulk energy. We also, though, besides energy, have another function of carbohydrates. Another kind of carbohydrate is called cellulose. Cellulose is in plant cell walls. A cousin of cellulose is called chitin. We find it in the cell walls of fungi. It's also the stuff that we find in the exoskeleton of insects. Chitin and cellulose both function in structure and rigidity. So in other words, it's what makes plant cells more rigid than animal cells, because of course plants don't have bones. They have to stand upright without the function, without that support, so they use cellulose to do it. If we take a look at the cellulose fibers, we see that each of these little hexagons are bonded together like they would be in starch, but they also have a number of cross bonds, which is what makes it such a sturdy molecule. Another note you may have realized, we're talking about sucrose, fructose, galactose, all of these end in ose, and so if you see a word that ends in ose, it's a pretty good indication that it's a carbohydrate. Let's pause there and do a quick review. Our next type of macromolecule also functions in energy, although it has lots of other functions as well. The next type is called lipid. Lipid's a little bit different. It doesn't quite have a monomer per se. In other words, it's not one thing that repeats over and over again, although it is made up of several different parts. Here are two examples of it. They're called fatty acids. And what you'll probably notice is that there's a lot of carbon and hydrogen. So that's one of our defining characteristics of a lipid, is that they have mostly carbon and hydrogen. If you'll notice, there is a little bit of oxygen on the end. It's called a carboxylic acid group. We talked about that in class already, where it's a functional group. But for the most part, what we're considering is this big chain of carbon and oxygen. If you remember our discussion of electronegativity, carbon and oxygen have a very close electronegativity, carbon and hydrogen, so they bond together with a nonpolar bond. So the most important thing is that they are nonpolar. So although they don't have a particular monomer, what they all have in common is that they are largely nonpolar. This structure is called fatty acid, and we see it in a lot of lipids. And again, we're just talking about lots of carbon and hydrogen bonded together with a carboxylic acid group. That's the fatty acid part on the end. So like I said, the structure varies, but the most important thing to have in your notes about that is that they are nonpolar. And if you recall, nonpolar things are hydrophobic, in other words, water-hating. So they're going to do their best when they're in an environment to stay together and avoid water. So once again, I can't emphasize enough, we're looking at mostly carbon and hydrogen. So there's a bunch of different kinds of lipids, and perhaps the most familiar is fat. Fats are known as triglycerides. The tri comes from the fact that they are made up of 3 fatty acids. Remember, a fatty acid are carbon-hydrogen bonds with a carboxylic acid group on the end. When we make them a triglyceride, in other words, putting them all together, we do a dehydration synthesis to connect them to what this molecule is known as a glycerol, also carbons and hydrogens. So these are triglycerides, and there are 2 kinds. We draw them like this because these fatty acid chains can be anything. They can have much longer carbon hydrogen bonds. They can be short. They can have some double bonds in there. So there's some variation. So to represent that variation, we use the letter R. So we have 2 major groups of triglycerides, or fats. You probably heard about them either in health class or on the news. We have saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats are called saturated because they have as many hydrogens as possible. So in other words, on the carbon-hydrogen chain on here, every carbon-hydrogen has 2 hydrogens on it, except for the end, which has 3. And so they have as many as possible. Unsaturated fats, or triglycerides, have some hydrogen bonds in the middle, which means that some of these, if we broke those hydrogen bonds, we could add more hydrogen to them. So they're unsaturated hydrogen. All you need to know is that they have at least 1 double bond. That gives them a kink, and because of that, at room temperature, they are liquid, where at room temperature, a saturated fat is a solid. It can pack a little bit better. And so if you think of saturated fats like butter, at room temperature is solid, where oil at room temperature is unsaturated. All of these you're probably familiar with as energy storage. If you don't use energy, it gets converted to fats. So they function in long-term energy storage. So in carbohydrates, if you don't use it right away, eventually those calories you take in will be converted to fats. Also, you're probably familiar with whales and animals that have blubber. That blubber is made up of fats too, and that's used for insulation. Notice this triglyceride, notice the variation that can happen on those 3 fatty acids. Here we've got an unsaturated fatty acid with 2 saturated fatty acids, and the 2 saturated fatty acids are in different lengths. So in other words, there's a lot of variation, but what they all have in common is just carbon and just hydrogen. Let's pause and review fats before we go on to the other types of lipids. So there's a lot of other lipids, and one of the ones that we're going to talk a lot about is phospholipids. We're going to have a whole section where we talk about the cell membrane, which is made up of phospholipids. Phospholipids are lipids because they have this fatty acid tail, remember, nonpolar, but they also have a phosphorus head. That phosphorus has phosphate, and the phosphate is actually polar. It's attracted to water. It's hydrophilic. A fatty acid tail, nonpolar, so it repels water. Because this molecule has both a water-loving side and a water-hating side, cells use it to be a really good membrane because it can control both hydrophilic and hydrophobic things. And in doing so, it can control what's allowed into and out of the cell. Phospholipids arrange themselves in a layer, so they actually have a section that's water-hating and a section that's water-loving. We're not going to cover cell membrane now, but it'll definitely come up again. Another type of lipid is steroids. Steroids, I don't really expect you to know anything about the structure other than lots of carbon and hydrogen. They're actually 4 linked carbon rings, and they're, as you can see, they're kind of complicated, but again, nonpolar, and this one has rings. And steroids make up hormones and cholesterol. Cholesterol, both good kind and the bad kind. And so hormones serve as chemical messengers. Cholesterol is used in cell membranes. Finally, we have waxes. When you use a wax, most of the time you're trying to keep water out. So waxes are made up of fatty acids and alcohols. Remember, alcohols is a functional group we learned about. I don't care that you know the structure of wax. What I do care about is that you know its function, which is, of course, waterproofing. When we put wax on, we put it on our lips for chapstick, or sometimes we cover cheeses and things like that with it, and that's to keep it from drying out. Fruits often will have a waxy coating, like the rind of an orange, to help prevent it from drying out. Why do I have a picture of a duck here? Well, ducks have a waxy coating on their feathers to help keep the water out, so when they're swimming for all that time, they don't become waterlogged. Remember, likes dissolve likes? Well, wax is nonpolar, oil is nonpolar, and so oil will dissolve the wax on the bird's feathers, which is why you see those Dawn commercials of them trying to get the oil off the feathers. It's really important they do that, because otherwise the birds, besides the fact having oil on them, won't be able to be waterproof. Let's review one more time. That's it for this video. In the next video, we'll talk about proteins and nucleic acid. As always, make sure you see me if you have any questions.